Welcome back to Revolutionary Gazette. My name's Jim, and we're standing here at a very important historic house with my good friend Travis Shaw from the Virginia Piedmont Heritage Area. And Travis, where are we today?
So we're in Clark County, Virginia, in the lower Shenandoah Valley. We're just outside the village of Boyce, and we're standing at a home known as Saratoga. Saratoga, one of the homes of General Daniel Morgan.
Who is Daniel Morgan? Why is he so important for the history of the Revolution?
So Daniel Morgan is one of my favorite people to talk about. In my opinion, he's one of the most important commanders of the Revolutionary War. He's a soldier that fights on almost every major campaign of the Revolution. Very, very important to the American victories at Saratoga, at Cowpens. Really becomes one of Washington's indispensable men. So, I love the fact that we're finally here at Saratoga. This is a bucket list location for me. I've never been here before, so.
Let's start off really from the beginning. What do we know about Daniel Morgan in his early life before the Revolution?
So we know very little about Morgan's childhood. He's born in New Jersey, probably about 1735. His parents are immigrants from Wales. Other than that, Morgan very, very rarely talked about his childhood, so the details are extremely sketchy. We do know that as a teenager, he arrives in the Shenandoah Valley. He basically walks into the town of Winchester with nothing but the clothes on his back. He's illiterate. He has no job prospects. He comes out here to what was at the time kind of the frontier of Virginia, or, just a generation or so removed from being the frontier, looking to make a new life for himself, like so many other immigrants that are coming down the Valley Road from Pennsylvania into the Shenandoah. Morgan really makes a name for himself just east of here at a place that was known in the 18th century as Battletown. It's modern-day Berryville, Virginia. He really has a reputation as a brawler, as a fighter. He'll pick a fight over just about anything. So through his teens and 20s, he is going to make a name just as one of the very kind of stereotypical frontiersmen, a guy who's quick to anger and quick to throw punches. So here in what will become Clark County, Morgan is first going to work as a wagoner. He's going to be driving wagons full of tobacco, wheat, other crops from the Shenandoah Valley across the Blue Ridge and into the Tidewater ports like Fredericksburg or Alexandria. And not only is this how he's making his living, but this is really, I think, where Morgan begins this transformation that's going to take place in his life, where he literally comes from nothing. He's got nothing but the clothes on his back. But he is going to make these kind of social connections with the people who own plantations out here, with these planters, large landowners, and he wants to become part of that class. He wants to own the property. He wants to become an independent planter. And that's really a transformation that he's going to undergo throughout the rest of his life.
That's interesting, and that opportunity comes kind of quickly for him with the onset of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And that's also where he has his first experience with the military. How does that go for him?
Well, Morgan's first military experience does not go very well for him. So he's serving as a wagoner with General Braddocks' army that's marching on Fort Duquesne. And there's two kind of formative things that happen while they're on this march into western Pennsylvania. Morgan, again, he's a brawler. He's quick to anger. At one point during the march, he strikes a British officer. Which is, an incredible offense, whether you're in the British Army or whether you're a teamster that's attached to the Army. The discipline is the same, and he'll actually be sentenced to 500 lashes. Certainly brutal by today's standards, although fairly typical for the kinds of punishments that are meted out in the armies of the 18th century. Morgan always made it a point of pride to say that he had stayed conscious during the entire time, and he always liked to joke that they only gave him 499 lashes, that he'd counted every single one, and that the king always owed him one more. Now, what I find even more remarkable about this story is supposedly later on, the British officer that he struck was so moved by watching Morgan and the way he handled this punishment that he actually came and apologized to Morgan for the offense, and the two of them, stayed fairly cordial on up to kind of the culminating event of Braddocks March, which is of course his defeat on the Monongahela. The British army is soundly defeated by the French and Indians there. Braddock, of course, is mortally wounded. His column is pushed back out of western Pennsylvania. And I think this is also kind of a formative moment because Morgan, I think there's a lot of things he takes from his experience with the British Army, certainly an understanding of discipline and the importance of discipline, but he also sees that, the British are not invulnerable.
So let's take us forward then to the American Revolution itself. Where does he start off when war breaks out between Great Britain and her colonies?
He's a commander of local militia company in Winchester when the war begins. And almost from the start, Morgan is going to play a central role in what happens in the early years of the Revolution. June 14th, 1775, Congress approves the raising of 10 rifle companies to go and march north to join Washington and his army in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 6 will be drawn from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia. Now, this is an important moment because this is really the birth of the United States Army. This is when the Continental Army truly becomes Continental. It's the first troops from outside of New England who are called to service. And Morgan is going to take command of one of those Virginia companies. He raises the company in Winchester, and they will set out north for Washington's army in July of 1775. And this is kind of the start of the myth of Morgan as a military commander, because what they will do is, in my opinion, extraordinary. It's an event known as the BLine March. Basically, Morgan and his company and Stevenson's company will essentially race each other to Boston, and they are going to cover over 500 miles in 3 weeks. In the summertime, all the way from Virginia to Massachusetts. And their arrival in the camps in Massachusetts is a huge moment for the troops that are there. It's very symbolic that these troops are marching from the South to join them. It's not just a New England war. It's not just a Massachusetts war anymore. It is a continental war. They also impress the New Englanders with their marksmanship. One of the things that sets these companies apart is, of course, they're armed with rifles. Much more accurate fire. The downside to that is these guys aren't accustomed to the discipline that Washington expects from his men. So there's going to be a lot of drunkenness, a lot of brawling. Again, these are frontier types. These are Daniel Morgan's people. Yeah. And so while they may certainly have a lot of military skill, they have a lot to learn when it comes to discipline.
So going back to the idea of them being rifle armed, Morgan really makes a name for himself as a commander of a light infantry, which includes rifles during the war, especially the early years of the war. So what is his experiences commanding riflemen, and what is his experience interacting with the rest of the Continental Army?
While the army is encamped around Cambridge, the initial excitement of the riflemen's arrival kind of wears off, and very quickly a little bit of resentment grows. One of the things we don't necessarily think about is sectional differences. These men from Massachusetts have never seen a Virginian before, and vice versa. They might as well be from different countries, very different culturally. So as I said, a lot of fights are going to break out between these men. Very early on, some of the riflemen are kind of excused from the fatigue duty that the New Englanders are doing, which breeds a lot of resentment. So Morgan and his company will be selected to leave the camp at Cambridge in September of 1775, and they're going to take part in one of the first major campaigns of the war, and that is the attack on Canada. Morgan and his company will be attached to a small army that's formed under the leadership of Benedict Arnold. And they are going to march overland across Maine and basically attack the city of Quebec by surprise.
So far, just in the year 1775, we've gone from the Shenandoah Valley to Massachusetts. We're going through Maine into Quebec.
Into Quebec, absolutely. Okay. And, those who know the history of the Revolution know that this expedition to take Canada is an absolute failure. For one, they assume it's about 180 miles or so. They're going to cross it in 20 days. Well, in actuality, the distance was almost double that. And they're in the woods of northern Maine, far from any sort of civilization. There are no roads, no farms, nothing, for 50 days. They lose about a third of the force turns around and goes back. They desert. They lose a lot of their provisions. The boats that they're using sink. So by the time they reach the gates of Quebec in November of 1775, men are dying of starvation, men are dying of exposure, it's snowing, they are barefoot, they have no winter equipment. And so One of the really important things about Morgan this entire time, his men are at the vanguard of this march. They're leading the way through the wilderness. They're using kind of those frontier skills that they've brought from Virginia, and they're going to take kind of the forefront of the attack on the city of Quebec.
Morgan himself goes through a pretty bad experience there. What happens to him?
He sure does. So the attack on Quebec is kind of two prongs, and Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan will lead the northern attack on the city. It's one of the few instances in the Revolution that we see like house-to-house combat. You know, Quebec is a pretty urban area, and to get to the fortified city, they have to attack through what's known as the lower town. And it's barricades after barricade after barricade along the streets. The Continentals are going to attack in the middle of a blizzard on New Year's Eve, 1775, you know, in the cover of darkness. Very early in the action, Arnold is going to go down. He's going to be shot in the leg, and Morgan will take over that prong of the attack. And he is going to literally lead his men block by block, house by house through the streets of the lower town. During one of the early parts of the assault, he actually mounts a barricade that's been built across the street, falls over the other side onto a cannon, and actually ends up probably fracturing some vertebrae. And as he's lying there in pain, the British are trying to bayonet him, so he actually has to roll under the cannon to avoid their bayonet strokes. Just to give you the kind of idea of how Morgan leads, he's always leading from the front. His men will take the barricades, but will eventually be surrounded in the streets of Quebec. And after several hours of violent house-to-house combat, he and his men will be captured by the British forces in Quebec.
So Morgan and his men are taken prisoners in Canada. They spend some time in prisoners. Eventually he's released, right?
Yes, yep. He'll be exchanged, and right around the time he's exchanged, he takes command of a newly formed regiment, the 11th Virginia Regiment. But he won't actually serve with that regiment for very long, because he is picked to lead essentially a provisional corps, a corps of hand-picked men from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, to serve as the Continental Army's kind of eyes and ears. It's a light infantry battalion. They're going to be marksmen who are serving at the very vanguard of the Continental Army. And they will be sent north to assist Horatio Gates's army up in New York during the campaign that will ultimately culminate at the Battle of Saratoga.
Obviously, with the naming of the house, I'm guessing Morgan and his men play a particularly important role in the Battle of Saratoga.
Vital role in the American victories at the Battles of Saratoga. You know, in the initial action at Freeman's Farm, Morgan's Riflemen are going to lead one of the attacks against the British forces. They're going to be driven back. Very, you know, kind of seesaw battle back and forth between Morgan's men and the British forces there. And then later on at the Battle of Bemis Heights, Morgan and his riflemen are going to play a kind of decisive role there. You know, with the increased accuracy of their rifles, they're able to pick off British officers. You know, General Fraser in particular falls victim to one of Morgan's marksmen. His aggressive actions, along with Benedict Arnold's aggressive actions, are really going to turn the tide at Bemis Heights and, you know, eventually force the surrender of Burgoyne's army. So if you ever seen the image of the surrender at Saratoga, this very famous image, you know, Morgan is there front and center in his hunting shirt, you know, as one of the more prominent American commanders there. And of course, when he comes back to the Shenandoah Valley in 1779, starts to build this beautiful home behind us, he names it after Saratoga for his pivotal role at that victory.
So you mentioned that he starts construction on this house in 1779. And that's almost smack dab in the middle of the Revolutionary War. Why is he back here on the home front building a house when the war is still going on?
So Morgan is going to take a leave from the Continental Army. He basically resigns out of, for two reasons. First of all is his health. As I mentioned, you know, he was wounded at the assault in Quebec. He's also got some old French and Indian War era wounds. He was shot through the face during the French and Indian War. So, you know, he's not feeling great. You know, his health is really suffering by this point in the war. And then there's also kind of the issue of his bruised ego. You know, here's a man who has put his life on the line multiple times. He's seen a lot of hard fighting through the first 2 years of the war. And he's certainly built up a reputation as an active battlefield commander, especially when it comes to those light troops. When the Continental Army puts together its light infantry division, he's expecting the command of this group, and instead it goes to one of his main rivals, Anthony Wayne. He certainly has no love for Wayne. He sees Wayne as responsible for, you know, the Paoli massacre that occurs during the Philadelphia campaign. And so he's personally a little offended by this. And so between his health and kind of being passed over for promotion, he resigns from the Army and he returns here to the Valley and, was kind of content to start building this house here and remain here. But in 1780, he is going to be called back into service.
So why is he being called back into service then in 1780?
The Continental Army has suffered some reverses down south. His former commander, Horatio Gates, gets defeated at the Battle of Camden. Everything's kind of falling apart in the Carolinas. And so Washington recognizes he needs a hard-fighting general to go down there and help kind of shore up the Continental cause in the Carolinas. And so Morgan immediately comes to mind. So Morgan is asked to go down south to join with Nathaniel Greene down there and take command of Nathaniel Greene's light troops in North Carolina. And that is what's going to eventually lead to probably the most complete Continental victory of the war, and that's Daniel Morgan's great victory at the Battle of Cowpens.
So Morgan's in sole command at the Battle of Cowpens of the American forces on the field. What does he do that makes this victory just so total?
He has a very keen understanding of kind of the advantages and disadvantages of the different troops in his army. For instance, he's got riflemen. Riflemen are very accurate, but they're also extremely slow to load. In a stand-up open fight, they're very vulnerable to British cavalry and to British light infantry. He's got a lot of militia. He recognizes that the militia bring numbers to the army, but they don't bring discipline. And so what he'll do at Cowpens is he's going to create a defense in depth. Out in the very front of his army, he has riflemen kind of arrayed as skirmishers. He has a secondary line of militia, and these militia are essentially under orders to fire 2 volleys and then retreat. He figures he can depend on them to hold it together long enough to get 2 shots off before they fall back. In the third and final line, he's got his Continental Army veterans. This is the backbone of the army. These are the guys that can be expected to do the heaviest fighting. He's going to rely on this kind of 3-line defense to wear the British down and to tire them out, disorganize them, and that's exactly what's going to happen. The British commander, Banastre Tarleton, very aggressive commander, is going to see this kind of skirmish line of what he assumes are militia, and he is going to charge headlong into them. And everything kind of works out exactly as Daniel Morgan has laid it out. Initially that first line, those riflemen are going to, pepper the British with kind of a skirmishing fire, slow them down, force them to deploy. Then they are going to fall back. That second line of militia, they are going to fire their volleys and they are going to break and retreat behind the third line. And of course, Tarleton sees this. He assumes the militia is breaking and running like they always do. And he is going to charge forward and run smack into that third line of Continental veterans. And while they are fighting with those veterans, that militia and those riflemen are going to reform and they are going to swing around, attack the British Army on its flanks. William Washington's dragoons are going to join into the fray. And so by the end of the day, almost the entirety of Tarleton's force is dead or captured on the field. It's a crippling blow to the British Army in the Carolinas, deprives Cornwallis of many of his best troops, and really frustrates their attempts to raise loyalists in the Carolinas to join the British cause.
Now, between Saratoga and Cowpens, those are probably the 2 best-known events that Morgan is known for in the American Revolution. Does he do anything up until the close of the war?
He will. Again, as I said, his health is really failing him at this point. So he will come back to Virginia. He's going to play a small role in an event known as Claypool's Rebellion, a small loyalist uprising that takes place out in what is now West Virginia. He'll lead local militia out there to put that event down. He plays a very small role in the Yorktown campaign. He takes command briefly in 1781. But really, his military career in the Revolution is more or less over after Cowpens.
What does he do for a living, and how does he live the remainder of his life after the Revolution?
So after the war, Morgan is going to return here to the lower Shenandoah Valley, and almost immediately he is going to get involved with local business. He works together with a local planter named Nathaniel Burrell to build a large grist mill just a few miles from us, the Burrell-Morgan Mill. That is going to become kind of the economic centerpiece of this part of Virginia. He's going to be bringing in grain from all the surrounding farmers, milling it, shipping it out of the ports in the Chesapeake Bay. That's going to become a tremendous moneymaker for him. He's also going to be involved briefly in politics. Morgan is a devoted Federalist. He's going to run for the House of Representatives twice. His first campaign, he loses terribly, but in his second campaign, he will be elected to Congress. So he serves in Congress for a few years. And kind of his last major public action is going to be during the Whiskey Rebellion. You know, we have all these farmers out in western Pennsylvania who are rebelling against, in this time, congressional taxation. Washington picks Morgan to command the force that's going to be marched out to the Pittsburgh area to put down this rebellion before it really takes off. I think it's also important to note that by the end of his life, he will kind of achieve the social status that he's really desired this whole time. You know, he's a successful businessman. He owns a tremendous amount of land here in the Shenandoah Valley and elsewhere. You know, he's married into a prominent family. He is, got the adulation of Washington and of Congress. You know, he eventually awarded a gold medal from Congress for his actions at Cowpens. And so by the time that he dies in 1802, you know, he certainly has the love, respect of his countrymen and will go down as one of the legendary figures of the American Revolution.
As a historian, if there was one thing that you would want viewers and future generations to take away about the life of Daniel Morgan, what would that be?
So I think in a lot of ways, Daniel Morgan is kind of our ideal when we think of what it means to achieve the American dream. You know, a lot of his contemporaries, people like, you know, say George Washington worked extremely hard his entire life to attain everything that he achieved. But Washington does have the advantage of birth. He has the advantage of, you know, family connections and wealth and so forth. You know, certainly people like Jefferson and, you know, so many of Morgan's contemporaries. What I love about Daniel Morgan is he literally comes from nothing. He is the illiterate son of immigrants who, as I walked into Winchester as a teenager with the clothes on his back, and from that, through hard work, through determination, through devotion to duty, and just being a hard fighting man, he is able to achieve everything that he set out to achieve. You know, it's a kind of example of social mobility in the 18th century that a lot of people could not achieve, and yet he really is able to make that dream a reality. And that's what I really love about Daniel Morgan.
Why do you think he's not as remembered as, say, someone such as Lafayette or some of the other Continental Army leaders?
So one of the things I think that really tarnishes his legacy is the political divide that we see in the early 1800s. You know, he's a devoted Federalist. He supports the kind of internal improvements the Federalist Party is pushing. With the election of Thomas Jefferson as president, though, that political view really starts to fall out of favor. And of course, by the time of the War of 1812, the Federalist Party is really starting to disintegrate. So I think that's one thing that tarnishes his legacy. He's also involved in some scandals after the war in which he, and he's certainly not alone in this among Continental Army officers, he starts to buy up soldiers' pensions and bounty lands kind of for pennies on the dollar, you know, these kind of vouchers that they would eventually get paid for their service. And he starts kind of speculating in that, and that leaves a really, really poor taste for a lot of the veterans who had served with him. You know, that he was almost profiting off of their poverty and their suffering after the war. So by the time he dies in 1802, his reputation has been tarnished somewhat. Now, through the 19th century, he's still going to be a fairly popular figure. We know that during the Civil War, a lot of soldiers visit Winchester from both armies. Many of them will actually talk about visiting Daniel Morgan's grave. This is someone that they've grown up reading about. He's certainly still considered part of the hierarchy of Revolutionary heroes. But I think really by the 20th century, in a lot of ways, his memory has largely been forgotten.
Working with the Virginia-Piedmont Heritage Area, are there any other sites associated with Morgan in the area that people can come visit?
So unfortunately, Saratoga here is privately owned, so you would not be able to visit this site. But there are a lot of sites associated with Morgan. You can visit Berryville. The Clark County Historical Association does a great job of kind of interpreting the early history of Morgan. They also operate the Burrell Morgan Mill, which is located in Millwood. You can go in there and see them grinding grain just like they would have done in Morgan's time. And of course, as we mentioned, his grave in Winchester.
Just a really amazing story, and thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
With that, I'm Jim. We're here at Saratoga, Daniel Morgan's home, and I can't wait to see everyone next time on the next issue of Revolutionary Gazette.